Chapter 1. The Spark in the Sky. Sarah Bennett had encountered unfairness before. Small, fleeting moments that pricked at her conscience like a splinter under the skin. She'd seen it in the tight-lipped smiles of passengers ignored, in the casual dismissals of her colleagues' concerns, in the way the world sometimes tilted toward those who demanded rather than deserved. But this time, on a routine flight from Chicago to Los Angeles, she couldn't turn her head. This time, a single moment would ignite her resolve, peel back the layers of quiet bias, and shift the trajectory of everything she thought she knew about courage. Would doing what was right cost her everything she'd built? Or would truth carve a path through the storm, proving stronger than the forces pushing against it? Sarah stepped lightly down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, her polished black flats tapping a soft rhythm against the carpeted floor. The cabin hummed with the low buzz of pre-flight chatter, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional ping of a call button. The air carried a familiar blend of brewed coffee and a sharp, sanitized bite of circulated oxygen, a scent she'd come to link with motion, with possibility. She smoothed the cuffs of her Navy flight attendant uniform, her hazel eyes sweeping the rows with the quick, trained precision of someone who'd spent 8 years deciphering people in a glance. In seat 3A, James Carter sat with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate. His hands rested lightly in his lap, fingers interlaced, an old habit of self-control he'd picked up somewhere along the way. His charcoal suit hugged his broad shoulders, the silk tie catching the faint glow of the overhead lights. His grandmother used to say that the way you held yourself shaped how others saw you. A piece of wisdom he'd carried like a shield through a world that often looked past him, or worse, looked too hard. James knew the truth. People saw what they wanted to see, and he'd learned to navigate that reality with a quiet grace. Across the aisle, in 3B, Daniel Pierce hadn't even settled into his seat before his restlessness took over. He shifted his weight, his lips twisting into a scowl, as if the flight itself were a personal affront. His voice cut through the cabin's murmur, sharp and tinged with a confidence that felt unearned. "Excuse me," he barked, snapping his fingers towards Sarah like she was a waitress at his golf club. "There's a problem here." Sarah approached with the calm poise she'd perfected over years of handling everything from spilled drinks to mid-flight meltdowns. "Is there something I can assist you with, sir?" she asked, her tone steady and professional. Daniel jerked his head toward James, his lip curling in disdain. "I don't know what's going on, but there's a smell. It's unbearable. I can't sit here like this." James blinked once, then twice, a slow breath filling his chest. A lifetime of holding himself together flickered behind his dark eyes. He turned his head slightly, meeting Sarah's gaze. There was no anger there, just the weary recognition of a man who'd faced this script before. Different stages, different actors, same tired lines. Sarah's fingers tightened at her sides for a split second before she forced them to relax. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but even, "I can assure you there's no odor." Daniel let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head as if she'd insulted his intelligence. "I'm not making this up. Just move him." A shadow passed over James's face, too subtle for Daniel to catch. He shifted his gaze past the man, out the small, oval window, as if gauging how far he could retreat into the endless stretch of sky. Sarah straightened, her words cutting cleanly through the tension. "We don't move passengers without cause, and there is no cause." The statement was simple, rooted in fact, but it landed like a challenge. Around them, the cabin stirred. Some passengers feigned disinterest, burying their noses in magazines, while others watched with unguarded curiosity. Daniel's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "I want to speak to someone in charge," he snapped. Sarah held his stare for a beat longer than necessary, then gave a curt nod. "I'll get my supervisor." She turned, her pulse a steady drumbeat against her ribs. She'd seen unfairness before. Hell, she'd even swallowed it down when the stakes felt too high. But not today. Not this time. Chapter 2. The Weight of Authority. The supervisor arrived moments later, his presence filling the narrow space with an air of reluctant command. Henry Sullivan, known to the crew as Sully, had salt and pepper hair and a face etched with the kind of patience that came from too many years smoothing over other people's messes. He nodded toward Daniel, his tone clipped but polite. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" Daniel jabbed a finger at James, his voice rising. "This guy stinks. I'm asking for some basic comfort here. Move him." Sully sighed, his eyes darting between Sarah and James before settling on Daniel. "Sir, we don't relocate passengers unless there's a valid reason." Daniel scoffed, folding his arms. "I'm giving you a valid reason. Do I need to take this higher?" Sarah caught the flicker of hesitation in Sully's posture, the quick mental math of a man who'd spent 2 decades balancing customer complaints against company policy. She could almost hear his thoughts. Is it easier to shuffle this quiet guy than deal with a loudmouth who might call corporate? Her stomach tightened. "Sir," she interjected, her voice cutting through the pause, "if there were a real problem, we'd handle it. But there isn't. Mr. Carter deserves the same respect as everyone else on this plane." Sully's lips pressed into a thin line, a silent warning flashing in his eyes. "Sarah, let me handle this." But James spoke up for the first time, his voice low and resonant, like a cello string plucked in a quiet room. "No, let him finish his act. I'm curious how this ends." Daniel's face flushed a deep crimson. "What did you just say to me?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "You want me gone because you think I don't fit here. But the truth is, you're unsettled by me just being in this space." A hush blanketed the first-class section. Daniel's mouth opened, then snapped shut, his bravado faltering under the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes now fixed on him. Sully cleared his throat, his tone brisk. "I think we should all return to our seats and get on with the flight." Daniel huffed, slumping back into his chair with a muttered curse. James exhaled, his fingers unclenching slightly. Sarah gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before resuming her duties, but the air around her crackled with unfinished business. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 3. Ripples in the Silence. James kept his eyes on the window as the plane climbed higher, the patchwork of fields and highways shrinking below. He'd been here before, countless times, in boardrooms and bars, on trains and planes. The slow drip of ignorance, the unspoken demand to shrink himself, to comply. But today felt different. The silence around him wasn't just heavy. It was expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sarah moved past him, her hands steady as she handed out drinks, her steps precise. She'd made her choice, and there was no unwinding it now. A quiet corner of her mind whispered doubts. What if this costs me my job? What if Sully writes me up, but a stronger, surer part drowned it out? Some moments demanded you plant your feet, no matter the fallout. Sully, meanwhile, paced the galley, his mind churning. He'd been in the airline game for 22 years, long enough to know the rules weren't always fair. Piss off the wrong passenger, and the backlash could ripple all the way to headquarters. Make the wrong call, and it could cost him his pension, or worse, his pride. He glanced back at Sarah, her calm efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in his head. She'd forced his hand, and he wasn't sure whether to thank her or curse her for it. The passengers nearby traded looks, their reactions a silent tally of the room. Some nodded faintly in Sarah's direction, a quiet show of support. Others turned away, too used to pretending they didn't see the kind of petty cruelty unfolding in front of them. Then, from the back of the cabin, a voice pierced the tension. "I think he deserves an apology." Head swiveled. A woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, sat ramrod straight in 5C. She fixed Daniel with a steely gaze, then turned to Sully, then Sarah. "I've been flying for 30 years. Never seen someone thrown to the wolves so fast for telling the truth." A man in a pinstriped suit, seat 4A, crossed his arms, his voice gruff. "She's right. This isn't okay." Daniel bristled, his neck reddening. "Mind your own damn business." James let out a slow, deliberate breath, a faint tilt to his head. "Seems like my business just got a lot bigger." Sully swallowed hard, sensing the shift. The tide was turning, and he was caught in its pull. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but firm. "You're not going anywhere." And just like that, the moment bent, not breaking entirely, not rewriting the world, but bending enough to matter. James allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Sarah stood a fraction taller, her shoulders loosening. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, but the real journey was just beginning.